Our fourth topic is Inventing the Middle East, Britain and the Persian Gulf in the Age of Global Imperialism. The people joining us are Guilllemette Crouzet from Warwick University in the UK in a conversation with Nauman Naqvi from Habib University.
Okay, Adab, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this discussion of Dr. Guillemmette Couzet's book, Inventing the Middle East, um, in Britain, the Gulf, in the Age of Global Imperialism, which was just published a few months ago, in October last year. It's actually a translation, but a highly developed edition of the book that was published in 2017. 2016, yeah. So an updated version of the book that Dr. Crouzet published in French. There's lots and lots to say about this book. Can we get the presentation up? Dr. Crouzet is the Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of History at the University of Warwick in Britain currently. This book covers a lot of different, some of the things are already indicated in the title. The Middle East, the invention of the Middle East, but it's about geopolitics, it's about empire, especially about the British Empire, but other empires. It's also part of this new history of the Indian Ocean, which helps us think in more complex ways than we usually do when we just think of land masses and territories. It's also part of the literature on globalization and the emergence of global markets. So if we have the presentation, I'll hand over to Dr. Crouzet. Yeah. Right. Thank you for your hard work. Yes, Dr. Crouzet.
Thank you very much. And I'm really delighted to be here today. So thank you for having me. Talking about my new book called Inventing the Middle East. My book was born out of a sense that an important dimension was missing in existing accounts of the genesis of the Middle East. As you probably know, we have whole library shelves of scholarly literature which are dedicated to describing how Western powers drew lines in the sand in the wake of the First World War and thereby recast the political borders of the region. This conjuncture saw the collapse of the territories of the old Ottoman Empire and their reformulation into a new and complex territorial mosaic. This new order was conceived largely around the geopolitics of oil. And it is usually assumed that the concept of the Middle East, with all the territorial and strategic upheavals it promoted, was launched from this early 20th century conjuncture. Yet, in my book, I seek to tell instead another history of the Middle East. And this iteration of the Middle East is to be found at a significant remove, not only chronologically, but also geographically, from the conventionally ascribed starting point around the First World War. For while Middle East has long been a very ubiquitous term in world affairs, the term's own antecedents and early invocations have remained curiously underexplored. When, in fact, was this label first imagined and why? What geographical spaces did it first denote? And what the entanglements of actors, conflicts, and processes underpinning these shifts, and which made the coining of that geographical term both meaningful and necessary, These are some of the questions I ask in my book. Could you show the first slide, please, of the PowerPoint? Thank you. That's it, it's good. No, the back, can we go back? Thank you. So by pursuing these questions, I present a new account of the Middle East invention. I explore how the idea of the Middle East emerged not from the First World War and its aftermath, but rather from much earlier conflicts centered on the 19th century Persian Gulf. Even before the oil boom of the 20th century, the Gulf region had taken on strategic importance for competing global empires. The fundamental dynamic in this was how the Gulf came to form a terraqueous crossroad and borderland guarding British India's western flank. The origins of the term Middle East can be traced precisely to Britain's long hegemony over the Indian subcontinent and its violent overspills into the Gulf and its hinterland. Can I have the second slide, please? So in my brief talk today, I want to give you an overview of the history I explore in my book, and then to put some flesh on the bones, I'll highlight one early episode from this in more detail. So British encroachment in the Persian Gulf region began by degrees under the expansionist East India Company in the late 18th century. It would be catalyzed by the geostrategic shock generated by France's invasion of Egypt, led by Napoleon in 1798. In the decades after that, it would be further ratcheted up by gunboats attacks conducted under British auspices in the name of pacifying Arab pirates, between inverted commas. Throughout the 1800s, this crucial geopolitical arena was then secured and transformed to become the crucible of an informal imperial system erected around British India. The creation of this sphere of influence in the waters and sands of the Gulf and its hinterlands was complex. The process involved a triangle of actors in London, on the Indian subcontinent, and in the Gulf region itself. So there were multiple iterations of this British presence in the Gulf. First, cartographical expeditions imposed a new geographical logic on this British Gulf. And the region's political economy, geared towards the globalizing trade in pearls, palm dates, and slave, was reordered to favor imperial priorities. Officials and speculators sought new passages to India running through Mesopotamia. Archaeologists unearthed artifacts of the region's ancient empires, and ideologues envisaged the rebirth of this cradle of civilization under British oversight. By the end of the 19th century, amid renewed waves of inter-imperial competition, this nexus of British interest and narratives in the Gulf region would occasion the appearance of a new term, the Middle East. Around the same period, apologists for empire would propagate celebratory retrospective narratives of this century-long history of British interventionism and overlordship in the Persian Gulf, with a view to justifying its transformation into a kind of British lake, while also seeking to sustain the wider region's open-ended continuation under imperial tutelage. Such accounts often celebrated Britain's history of informal empire in the region as one characterized by fair and benevolent custodianship. Yet, the realities of how the British, and more particularly the emergent semi-autonomous imperial administration of British India, had projected themselves into this contested Gulf region, emerge in my book in a markedly different light. A critical interrogation of the historical record, notwithstanding that the available archives and other sources are largely of British official origin, strongly suggests that the policies of intervention in the region only belatedly resembled a grand design and at no point a disinterested one. Indeed, in the later 18th and early 19th century, there had been significant debates among British officials regarding what the most efficient policy to adopt in the region might be. Even when an informal agenda did begin to take shape, its enactment remained fraught. It included periods of conflict involving considerable violence. And indeed, these were some notable and military setbacks in the hand of local actors in the Gulf, with these being highly embarrassing to the British. Nevertheless, these decades of British imperial meridian in the region would gradually coalesce into a distinct pattern of indirect rule. As elaborated and systematized from the mid-19th century on, this ensured regional security and pacification, conditions of immense knock-on benefit to British India, with, in the end, relatively low running costs. The early globalization of the Gulf economy, with the local sheikhs and other rulers instrumentalized as brokers under British auspices, would prove to be of central importance in these developments. British influence in the region, that would henceforth be dubbed the Middle East, came under challenge in the final decades of the 19th century. New interloper powers, Germany, the most prominent among them, sought to invert themselves into the strategic crucible of the Gulf, threatening to weaken Britain's position in the region. In the event, however, the informal empire the British had constructed in the Gulf's water and sand would be supplanted and transformed in quite rapid and unexpected ways during the fallout from the First World War. This new conjuncture, from 1914 onwards, would see the Middle East reinvented around oil. In the ensuing years, a new kind of British colonial regime, administered from London across a swathe of former Ottoman territories, quickly overshadowed what had come before. But given this peak of British direct rule across a very different iteration of the Middle East down to the middle of the 20th century, it has become all the more difficult to comprehend that there had been, in fact, a much longer history of British imperial entanglements and interventionism in the Gulf region, dating back to the age of Napoleon from 1798 onwards. And that's the story I tell in my book. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Yeah, I could talk about it later, yeah.
Can you, yeah, there we go. So, in a long line of books, I guess, since the 80s, of course, in your field, your book is new, but in a long line of books about inventing, constructing, since the 80s, imagining, all of these revelations really about how recent our world, the world we take for granted, the world in which we live, how recent that world is. I mean, I suppose history is always about both continuity and discontinuity. But in this modern period, the discontinuities seem to prevail, and they actually seem to be accelerating. So I take it that the point of your book, well, it of course extends from the 19th century. Who would have thought that the Middle East, actually, the category itself is just circa 1900, and then picking up pace, but really only coming into its own with World War II, from your account. And then especially during the Cold War. So it's that recent. It's really becomes discursively normalized less than a century ago, which itself should be a revelation to all of us. And then the other really surprising fact is that, given the fact that we've come, all of us sitting in this room, have come into a world which is already dominated by oil. The other surprising thing is that the Middle East comes to be a focus I mean, now we think of us, this region, South Asia, as being more of a backwater than the Middle East, which seems to be more important than this region. But in fact, the story you tell is that the Middle East became important because of South Asia. That it was actually to defend, on the one hand, who could have thought that they would think that all the way from the northwest frontier province, which is the outer limit, already a buffer zone with Afghanistan, all the way from Afghanistan to the Mediterranean. Of course, when our own generals today think of strategic depth, which I'm sure you've heard of, when they think of Afghanistan, for the British, the strategic depth extended all the way to the Mediterranean. So one of the first things that's amazing is how recent the world in which we live is. And now being 50-something myself, I've gotten used to the idea that there are these remarkable discontinuities. Now, one of the purposes of these, inventing, constructing, imagining, is to free up our imagination. Yeah, the purpose is because as long as these categories, which are very recent categories, continue to dominate our ways of thought, as long as we continue to take them as being natural categories, we are unable to think otherwise. So, in your case, what kind of freeing up of our concepts, our imaginations, etc., practices, institutions, what kinds of liberatory or emancipatory effects might such an history have? How might it free us up to think otherwise?
Thank you. I guess really what I've tried to do in the book is to shift away from the traditional narrative of the Middle East as, this term really embedded in international affairs, in the history of oil, in the history of the Cold War, and in the history, in the end, of a growing US intervention in that region with the withdrawal of the British Empire from India in 1945 onwards, if not before. And I really wanted to re-emphasize that we need to think about the Middle East differently. First, in terms of geography, so question the borders that have been drawn since 1918, 1945, around oil, around the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, around French and British, mostly French and British imperial interest before American interest, and to tell a different history, a history of a space that before being about oil, about sand, about deserts, about imperial and British imperial and American interest, was about water, about connections, about a world of merchants trading in the Indian Ocean, about early communities such as the Khawazim of Ras El Khaimah, trading with South Asia. So it's been really that history that I'm trying to tell, and how there was also a first idea of the Middle East invented by the British before they took on this sort of like larger imperial guardianship in the region with the mandates. And this is this very early idea of the Middle East that I was interested in, how the Middle East then at the time could be seen not just about borders and oil, but about connections and about protection in some ways. So the Middle East being first a border protecting British India. So being part of a large array of buffer states. So you've cited Afghanistan, there was also Persia, the northwest frontier, parts of Baluchistan, and how the Middle East played this key strategic function of protecting British India for the British, protecting it from invasions, protecting it in the context of the Great Game. So in the fear of like a Russian advance on the British territories in the subcontinent. And the second thing that really was striking for me when I was looking at this early history is to see how the Middle East was a sort of early promised land for the British. a land or a region that could also not only protect but connect. So how, in the end, the Middle East, around the region of the Persian Gulf, was a route parallel to Suez that would enable connections between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, and in some ways between a very vast system of land and seas. But it was a region of promise, where the prosperity of old empires, so the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, so the great Persian dynasties, etc., could be reborn thanks to British tutelage, thanks to connection enabled by steam. So I looked at all these projects in my book to open the Euphrates to steam navigation, to open the Shat el Arab, while Suez at the same time was being opened. And I think what's really striking when you look at this early history of the Middle East is that it was already a system, a region-making system, but not with borders, but with seas and land enabling connections. And again, I think what I try to do in the book is to depart from this narrative of the Middle East as just a region of conflict, the conflict where we look when we need oil, in terms, especially in these times of like energy crisis, but that in the 19th century there was this dream on the British tutelage to recreate some of the prosperity of the Hanging Garden of Babylon, to refine the Garden of Eden, or to recreate it around the Persian Gulf. And this is what I found probably the most striking in this history. It's a promised land for the British. It would remain so after the First World War, but in the 19th century, it's an idea that is extremely strong. And it also enables in some ways to, as you said, sort of like rethink the political geography of the British Empire around British India as a center, and around British India as sort of governing the whole geography, not only just around Suez, but around a much larger region.
Right. Yeah, so the British trying to imagine themselves as successors to these great
Exactly.
Ancient empires. So both in terms of imagining themselves in the continuity of imperial states, but also of religious significance. The other question that I wanted to ask you is about the story of indirect rule that you tell, because in the Middle East, a lot of it is informal empire. So what they have is these subsidiary alliances, which of course they started off in India in the late 18th century with the Nawab of Arcot and others, Awadh later. Famously, this system of subsidiary alliances which they developed, and they started doing the same in the Middle East. What is the legacy of those subsidiary alliances and of indirect rule?
Thank you. As you said, what I found fascinating is how the British exported from the Indian subcontinent the system of indirect rule. So if in India they used the princely states, in the Gulf they used local tribes, local tribal dynasties, which in some ways they crafted, they also invented. They took advantage of patterns of migration and settlements along especially the Arabian coast of the Persian Gulf, migration that had happened in the 16th and 18th century, with further upheaval with the rise of the Wahhabi in the Arabian Peninsula. And the British chose to sign alliances with local powers in the Gulf, starting with the Sultan of Oman, then after with the sheikhs of what is today the United Arab Emirates, but also Bahrain, Kuwait, and much later Qatar in the 20th century. And I guess the biggest legacy has been in how these power dynasty and power dynamics have survived today, and how, for example, the United Arab Emirates, but also the states of Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait are created around these Arab dynasties, which then, in the context of the creation of their nation state in the 60s and in the 70s, have also created a narrative of their own history, which is in some ways heavily influenced by the history the British had written. So a history that, yes, it started on a coast that was a nest of pirates, but then the pirates changed and became traders, but that there was this whole history of connection with the Indian Ocean, the tradition also of pearl diving, pearl trading, which is heavily important for Bahrain, but also for Abu Dhabi. And also, I think this is the biggest legacy. And the borders also of these states have been partly drawn by the British and British political agents in the 20th century, taking into account, obviously, the regional ambitions of Saudi Arabia, and again, the geopolitics of oil. And these dynasties survive on, obviously, oil revenues, how to invest and reinvest oil revenues, gas revenues into hedge funds. And I think also one interesting thing is how these states in the Persian Gulf have reinvented themselves is in two crossroads of the world. So that you see into airport hubs such as Qatar, for example, or Abu Dhabi. So really reimagining, reforging themselves in terms of political economy, are at the center of a vast region which where you've got links sort of like crisscrossing the whole of the Indian Ocean, but also the Indian subcontinent, West Asia with Persia, and further of Afghanistan. And I think what we see today in these reinvention, these economics links, this political economy, in some ways it's quite interesting because, again, it makes us rethink the borders of the Middle East as we know it today. And it forces us again to envisage another geography, probably.
Right. You have a whole chapter on map making and surveys, which are so crucial to the modern imperial enterprise. I come from an anthropology background, so Mahmoud Mamdani, amongst others, have spoken about how indirect rule involved also the reinvention of custom, both the reinvention as well as the sort of, what should one say, reification of custom. So what we see today from the story you're telling, a lot of what is considered customary authority in this entire region, now called the Middle East, is very recent. It's a very recent invention, and together with these imperial powers. The other question I had for you was about, so I was very struck, I am more and more struck by the fact that so many people, literate people, but perhaps not just literate either, but primarily literate people, are obsessed with geopolitical thinking today. Yeah, so you'll see, even in a place like Pakistan, for instance, where Russia invaded Afghanistan, and this completely transformed this region, really. In the wake of the invasion of 79, so we have this terrible terrible memory, terrible experience of Russian imperialism. Not to speak of course, British and American imperialism. That's the competing imperialisms is the kind of scene that we have today. But lots of people, literate people today, big fans of Putin, yeah, in Pakistan, yeah. You'll see big fans of Bashar al-Assad. You'll see fans of also Khamenei. And these are largely for geopolitical reasons, yeah. To my mind, your history is also, the history you have written, is also a history of geopolitical thinking. Because it's geopolitical thinking also is recent. People didn't used to think geopolitically before the period that you're talking about. Isn't that right?
Yeah, no, I think I've written the book also probably against geopolitics,
yes,
or against the geopolitics of the 20th century. So I take the Middle East, from its invention by the first geopoliticians. So the Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American naval strategist, who theorized sort of like the burst of American power beyond the Atlantic, and sort of theorized he's one of the first theorists of American hegemony. I take also Valentine Shirol. I look at how in the early 20th century there were all these theorization of hegemony, regional power, And I think I write against that, saying that we need to depart from it to look at another history that was not just about geostrategy, but that was about imperial inventions, imperial connections, and really the fashioning of imperial rule, which is different than just geostrategy and hegemony. Because what I'll try to show in the book is that there was not a grand British strategy from the start in 1798 when Napoleon basically dared to challenge British hegemony in the Mediterranean, but also in Egypt and potentially over India. There was not a grand design about what the British were going to do, how they were going to react from London and from British India. There was a lot of debate in London amongst the cabinets, among Whitehall officials on how to forge British imperial rule in the Orient at the time. There was a lot of debate also in India on how to fashion imperial rule in the Persian Gulf. And this is what I show in the book. There was no grand strategy. There were only small steps, negotiation, a lot of setbacks, a lot of failures, and in the end, the imperial structure that was created by the British around the Persian Gulf. So before the First World War, in some ways is a patchwork that worked around and thanks to different things: gunboats, maritime patrol, a political economy, treaties, local alliances, local residents of the East India Company and then of the Indian government. So I guess that's what I do. I think I write against geopolitics and I show that imperial rule is not, that maybe we can think of geopolitics and geostrategy as the child of empires. Yes, maybe, but imperial rule and empires are not about grand strategy, even from taking a very light post-colonial perspective, because what I say in the book is that, we have almost no archives, no records of the literary societies of the Persian Gulf. So I tell this history from British archives. That's my methodology. But even when you read against the grain these archives, you can see all the setback and the cracks in the imperial rule.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, like so-called realism, geopolitical thinking, which is of course intimately tied to this modern realist doctrine, it makes it impossible to think ethically or morally about anything, really. Yeah. Did ancient empires think geopolitically? I'm asking. Pre-modern empires.
Pre-modern empire.
Because it really comes, so geopolitics itself, I believe, is, the term itself is this Swedish, Rudolf, what's his name? His name is skipping my mind right now. It's early 20th century.
Late 19th, early 20th century, yeah.
Late 19th, early 20th century. So, in fact, so just like your own term, Middle East, it might have slight prehistory. So, even though Middle East comes into usage in the early 20th century by your telling, in fact, it has this prehistory, which is, and you use Koselleck for that. So as a teleological, as a retrospective, as well as a teleological concept. Yeah, both. It's both. So similarly, geopolitics must also have a prehistory. How far back do you think that goes?
I guess it depends. Again, the methodology we use to analyze, as you said, the history of these ancient empires. I don't know, when you look at Assyria, when you look at the remains of the Assyrian Empire, they certainly conceived in some ways their place in what they saw the world, or the borders of the imagined world, in a certain way. Same for the Roman. There was a theorization of Rome's imperial rule in the Mediterranean and over, North Africa. All empires theorize, conceptualize, I think, their own rule, the definition of their own rule, and how they rule their own world and the world they imagined. I still think that when we look at imperial history, we do something different than geopolitics or analyzing geopolitical thinking, because we, as imperial historians, and I think that's the way I would define myself, we always question how locally this imperial rule was enforced or not enforced. The grand narrative, which most of the time characterizes geostrategical thinking, geostrategy, or geopolitics. And I think, it's not fortuitous that geostrategy emerged as a discipline with America's hegemony and America defining itself as a world power. And I think this is something different. Imperial history is different for that.
Right. So this guy, American Rear Admiral Alfred
Thayer Mahan.
Yeah, this book about sea power.
Sea power, yes.
Yeah.
Which is a theorization of
Late 19th century
geopolitics, rivalries amongst nation state and empires for the control and domination of the seas. So what he describes in his book, published in the early 19th century, 20th century, I think it's in 1902, is in the end British naval power institutionalized and controlled the pilgrimage. And all the quarantine stations, for example, all the steam routes with the steamers, all the rules that they sort of like created and implemented around the pilgrimage. I think in some ways, for the literature, there's a book by John Slight, which was published with Harvard University Press, I think now 10 years ago. I think it's called India's Muslim Empire, something like that. And it's about this control of the Hajj routes by the British. But where you question, I think it is really interesting is that, again, there were connections, with Mecca and Medina and the sacred geography of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, of Shia Islam as well, let's not forget, in Iraq, that also crisscrossed South Asia, that crisscrossed Central Asia, and that were sort of, again, not destroyed, but a bit, erased again by, after the First World War, when the borders were drawn around Iraq, around Iran, etc., and etc. And I think this geography, this holy, sacred geography of the pilgrimage that the British took control of, again, challenges the geography of the Middle East that we know today.
G.
I'm Christian Professor. What did I get from the book that you tried to describe British legacy in the Middle East? I was interested to explore the connection between current conflicts in the Middle East and specifically the conflict between Israel and Palestine, which is still haunting the local population. And again, asked it, did you explore the connection in overall Middle East? Because wherever Britishers ruled, that conflict is still haunting local communities and directly undermining the human development of indigenous communities. So did you explore it in that way, or is your perspective is simply pro-imperialist and trying to justify whatever the British did?
No. So, and I just want to make clear, my book is not a justification of imperial rule. It's a deep study of how indirect rule was imposed around the Gulf region, but it's by no way a justification or a praise of of a very long century, because I talk of the 19th century of imperial rule. I describe the violence that unfolded. I describe, in the end, again, the artificiality of the creation of an idea that has had, as you say, a very long-lasting legacy around the names, Persian Gulf, Arabo-Persian Gulf, how the British played a role in that, in favoring the sheikhs in their policies to the extent of the Qajar dynasty in the 19th century. For your second question about Palestine and Israel, no. It's another story. It's a story of the 20th century with the creation of the Palestinian Mandate. It's not something that I look at. Again, there are shelves of books around, the creation of the Palestinian Mandate, and then, the huge impact of the creation of Israel and the Nahda in the Middle East. And it's not something that I do. it's not my century, it's not my field. And really what my book is about the Persian Gulf and how it played a central part in the history of the British Empire and for British India.
So, if I may, I can vouch for the fact that this is not a pro-empire book. Right? And secondly, the Sykes-Picot, etc., all of those, the mandates, the history that Dr. Crouzet is doing is kind of the background, the historical background to what happened in the 20th century. So in a sense, it does inform your book, but it's the precondition, So before the First World War, so most of the period that Inventing the Middle East covers is from the late 18th century through to the early 20th century, So it's mostly the 19th century. But in terms of your question, it's relevant because this very imagining of the Middle East as this geostrategic, which of course then became the basis for the mandates. And Dr. Crouzet is telling the history of that. So it's relevant in that regard. Anybody else? Any other questions? Well, if there's one question in the back. G. Wahhabis.
Yes, the Wahhabis. And
what role do the Wahhabis play in your story?
I mean, the Wahhabis actually play a big role from the 1780s, probably, as you know, as the rise of the first Wahhabi state. And I show, how it's influenced the geopolitics, actually, of the region with local invasions, putative alliances with the local sheikhs on the Arab Gulf. And what I show is how the British in some ways instrumentalized the Wahhabi and instrumentalized this fear of Wahhabi incursions in promising the local sheikhs if they were signing alliances with them. So the Sultan of Oman, the sheikhs of Abu Dhabi, Ajman, Dubai, and etc., that British protection would offer them protection against Wahhabi raids. And it's quite interesting then, so it's just, it's a small part of the story, but then the British are sort of positioning themselves as, as important as later Muhammad Ali and the Egyptian pashas, right? So you had Muhammad Ali from Egypt regaining control for the Ottoman Sultan in the Arabian Peninsula, but on the other side you had the British sort of guarding the coast of the Gulf against Wahhabi incursions. And it's really fundamental. So I really look at the first Wahhabi state before the second one, but the Wahhabi played a huge part. And then again, as I said, in the 20th century, negotiating of borders, negotiation of influence, right? And of course, oil after. Thank you.
Okay, I think our time is up. Thank you very much to Dr. Crouzet, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you.